You think that badge request is going to save you out here? The deputy's flashlight snaps off, plunging the shoulder of County Road 12 into darkness. Red and blue strobes from his cruiser paint the Georgia pines in alternating nightmare colors. And in that sudden blindness, a woman sitting behind the wheel of a silver rental sedan hears exactly what she expected to hear: the metallic click of handcuffs being freed from a duty belt. Her hands remain on the steering wheel. 10 and 2. Deliberate positioning learned not from a defensive driving course, but from 26 years of briefings about what happens when certain people make sudden movements during certain encounters on certain roads in certain counties. The interior dome light illuminates her face, her Virginia driver's license visible on the dashboard where she placed it, her rental agreement beside it. Everything documented, everything visible, everything done exactly right. And none of it matters to the man standing outside her window, his silhouette blocking the distant glow of a farmhouse half a mile down the road. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Now." She asks one question. Her voice carries no tremor, no defiance, nothing that could be characterized later as aggressive or non-compliant. Just 5 words, spoken at a volume the dashcam microphone will capture clearly. "May I have your badge number?" The silence that follows lasts 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the deputy's hand completes its journey to his belt. Not to the citation book in his breast pocket, not to the radio on his shoulder, to the cuffs, already open, already waiting for wrists that haven't committed any crime. His partner's cruiser appears in the distance, lights activated, accelerating toward this stretch of empty road like backup has already been requested for something that hasn't happened yet. The woman notes the time on her dashboard clock. 9:47 p.m. October 14th, Barton County, Georgia, the same county where her father died during a traffic stop 35 years ago, on a road just like this one, asking questions just like the one she asked. History doesn't repeat, they say, but sometimes it rhymes with such precision that the echo sounds exactly like the original. The deputy reaches for her door handle. 14 hours earlier, she had crossed the Barton County line at 7:34 a.m. Not 7:34, 07:34, the way she'd written time for longer than most of the deputies in this county had been alive. The silver Toyota Camry was deliberately anonymous, a rental selected specifically because it said nothing about the person driving it. No government plates, no military decals. Nothing that would mark her as anything other than what she appeared to be: a well-dressed black woman in her late 40s, driving through rural Georgia on a Tuesday morning in October. The welcome sign had faded since her last visit 9 years ago, the paint peeling around the letters that spelled out Barton County, where neighbors are family. Someone had spray-painted over the population number, updating it from 12,000 to something illegible. Progress, perhaps, though not the kind anyone celebrated. She pulled to the shoulder briefly, just past the county line, and made a notation in a small leather notebook. 0734 HRs, entered jurisdiction, odometer, 47,291. Weather, clear, 60-70 GF, unlimited visibility. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, the product of decades writing situation reports, after-action assessments, intelligence summaries that could mean the difference between mission success and congressional inquiry. Denise Hartwell had grown up in this county, left at 18 for Fort Benning, and never returned except in dreams that still visited her 3 or 4 times a year, dreams where red and blue lights flashed against her childhood bedroom window, and her mother's scream echoed off linoleum that had been replaced decades ago. Dreams where her father's body lay face down on asphalt, while someone's radio crackled with static and voices discussed paperwork as though the man bleeding into the pavement was already a problem to be managed, rather than a life to be saved. She checked her watch again, a habit, just a habit, and pulled back onto the highway toward the Quick Mart on Route 41. The gas station hadn't changed since 1998. Same flickering Coca-Cola sign with 2 letters burned out. Same cracked parking lot with weeds pushing through expansion joints that hadn't been maintained since the Clinton administration. Same suspicious look from the clerk when certain customers walked through the door. A look that had nothing to do with behavior and everything to do with assumptions made before behavior could even be observed. Denise filled her tank at pump 4, then went inside for coffee. The clerk was white, mid-60s, with bifocals on a beaded chain, and the particular posture of someone who'd spent 40 years standing behind a counter watching people she'd already decided to distrust. "Help you find something?" The question came while Denise stood directly in front of the coffee station. The sign above it, sun-bleached but legible, read "Self-serve." "Just coffee. Thank you." She poured a medium dark roast, added nothing, and carried it to the register. The clerk examined her $20 bill under the counterfeit detection light twice before making change, a process that took roughly 4 times longer than necessary. No receipt was offered. Denise asked for one. The clerk's jaw tightened as though the request constituted some kind of accusation, but the printer whirred and paper emerged. Denise folded the receipt precisely, once lengthwise, once widthwise, and placed it in her notebook beside the time entry. 0758, Quick Mart, $47.83, Pump 4, Attendant, WF, approximately 65. A habit. Nothing more than a habit, the kind developed over years of documenting details that might matter later, that usually didn't matter, but occasionally meant everything. Outside, she sipped the coffee and watched a county sheriff's cruiser roll past on Route 41. The deputy inside, young, white, buzz-cut, visible through the window, tracked her with his eyes for the 3 seconds it took his vehicle to pass the gas station entrance. Not stopping, not slowing beyond the natural deceleration of someone checking his surroundings, just looking, the way certain people looked at certain other people in certain places, where belonging was assumed for some and questioned for others. Denise noted the cruiser's unit number, 14, filed it away with everything else. The Magnolia Diner sat on the corner of Main Street and 3rd Avenue, a converted railroad car that had been serving breakfast to Barton County since 1962. The interior smelled like bacon grease and industrial coffee, the specific aroma of every small-town diner in America that refused to update its menu or its decor because change was for places that didn't know who they were. Her cousin Yvonne was already seated in a booth by the window, 2 teenagers across from her scrolling phones with the single-minded focus of their generation. Yvonne stood when Denise entered, the family resemblance clear in the set of their jaws, the shape of their eyes, the particular shade of brown that marked them as related even to strangers who didn't know the history they shared. "Look at you!" Yvonne pulled her into an embrace that lasted exactly as long as embraces between black women who hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade should last. "Looking like you stepped out of a magazine. Looking like I've been driving since 4 a.m. Denise slid into the booth opposite Yvonne's children, who glanced up from their phones long enough to mutter greetings before returning to whatever algorithm currently demanded their attention. These 2 got big. That's what happens when you stay away 9 years. The observation carried no accusation, but Denise heard what lived beneath the words anyway. 9 years since she'd visited. 9 years since the funeral of an aunt she'd barely known but felt obligated to mourn. 9 years since she'd walked these streets and remembered what they'd taken from her. The waitress appeared with menus and water, a young white woman in her early 20s whose smile seemed genuine enough until her eyes registered the composition of the table. Not hostile, just aware, the way people became aware when the normal distribution of a space was disrupted by presences that didn't match expectations. Yvonne ordered for the table, pancakes for the kids, eggs and toast for herself, coffee refill for Denise. The waitress wrote it down and departed with the particular efficiency of someone who wanted this transaction completed as quickly as possible. "Mama says you're doing some kind of consulting work now." Yvonne's voice dropped slightly, the way voices did when approaching topics that lived in gray areas. "Government stuff. Something like that. She also says you've been asking questions about Daddy's case." Denise set down her coffee cup with more care than the gesture required. "I always ask questions about Daddy's case. Questions to people who might actually answer them, I mean." Yvonne leaned forward, her voice dropping further. "Word travels in this county. You know that. Somebody told somebody who told somebody that a woman from Arlington was calling the state attorney general's office about old police files." The pancakes arrived before Denise could respond. The waitress distributed plates with mechanical precision, then retreated to the counter where another server, older, watching with undisguised interest, waited for the report on what the women in the corner booth were discussing. If you're already hooked by where this is headed, tap that subscribe button because this story is just getting started. Denise ate a few bites of Yvonne's toast, the silence between them, comfortable enough but heavy with things unsaid. The teenagers finished their pancakes and asked permission to wait in the car, permission granted with the relief of mothers who needed adult conversation more than adolescent supervision. "I'm not here to start trouble," Denise said finally. "I'm here to document." "Document what?" "Patterns." She pulled her notebook from her bag, opened it to a page filled with entries in her precise handwriting. 47 excessive force complaints filed against this department in 3 years, all 47 ruled unfounded by Internal Affairs. 3 of those complaints came from military families stationed at Fort Morrison, 30 miles west. Those 3 triggered a federal review. Yvonne's eyes widened slightly. Federal review meaning what exactly? Meaning the Department of Defense asked someone to take a closer look, quietly, without the department knowing someone was looking. And that someone is you. Denise closed the notebook. That someone drove a rental car into this county 14 hours ago and will drive out of it tonight, having completed an assessment that will either confirm or deny whether the patterns in those complaints constitute systematic civil rights violations requiring federal intervention. The words hung between them like smoke, formal, precise, the language of reports and briefings rather than conversations between cousins in a diner booth. "Denise," Yvonne's hand covered hers on the table. "These people don't play. You know that better than anyone." "I know exactly what these people do." Denise's voice hardened slightly, then softened with visible effort. "That's why I'm the one they sent." After breakfast, she drove. Not aimlessly, never aimlessly. Nothing in her life had been aimless for 26 years, but with purpose disguised as wandering. The route she followed traced a map that existed only in her memory and in the classified briefing document she'd memorized before leaving Arlington, a document that listed 17 locations within Barton County where civil rights complaints had allegedly been violated, where force had allegedly been excessive, where evidence had allegedly disappeared, and witnesses had allegedly been intimidated, and justice had allegedly been denied. Allegedly. The word that separated accusation from proof, complaint from conviction, pattern from policy. Her first stop was the intersection of Highway 41 and Industrial Drive, the location referenced in complaint number 2021 CF 0847. Private First Class Marcus Delgado, 23 years old, stationed at Fort Morrison. Pulled over for a broken taillight that witnesses later testified was functioning perfectly. Removed from his vehicle for failure to produce registration quickly enough. Handcuffed, pushed against the hood of his own car, and informed that he was being detained for suspected drug activity based on the odor of marijuana that neither the responding officer's body cam footage nor the subsequent vehicle search had confirmed. The broken jaw had come when Delgado allegedly resisted. According to the incident report filed by Sergeant Marcus Wynn, the suspect had attempted to flee custody, necessitating physical restraint that unfortunately resulted in facial injuries requiring surgical intervention. According to the 3 witnesses who'd observed the encounter from the parking lot of the auto parts store across the street, Delgado had been standing completely still when Deputy Cole Renfro's elbow connected with his mandible. The body cam footage from that encounter had been ruled corrupted due to equipment malfunction. Both officers' cameras simultaneously for the duration of the physical altercation. A coincidence that the Internal Affairs investigation, led by Lieutenant Bo Prescott, had accepted without apparent skepticism. Denise parked her rental car in the auto parts store lot and photographed the intersection from multiple angles. GPS coordinates, timestamp, corresponding complaint number, all recorded in her notebook with the methodical precision of someone building a case rather than conducting tourism. The second location was the parking lot behind the Barton County Courthouse, where Sergeant Teresa Williams, Army Reserve, deployed twice to Afghanistan, had been detained for 11 hours after requesting badge numbers during a traffic stop in 2022. The arresting officer had claimed Williams was interfering with official police business. The prosecutor had declined to file charges after Williams's JAG-appointed attorney pointed out that requesting badge numbers was constitutionally protected speech. But the 11 hours had already happened. The night in holding had already been spent. The lesson had already been taught. Denise photographed the parking lot, noting the positions of security cameras that should have captured Williams's detention and the chain-link fence that would have obscured certain angles. According to the complaint file, footage from 3 of the 4 cameras had been unavailable due to storage system errors. The 4th camera's recording showed only Williams being led into the building, not the 20 minutes that preceded her arrest. The 3rd location was a residential street in what passed for Barton County's suburbs, modest houses with American flags and boat trailers, and the occasional Trump sign still weathering in yards 3 years after the election. Complaint number 2023 CF 0396. Staff Sergeant Jerome Patterson and his wife Monica pulled from their vehicle at gunpoint during a felony stop that turned out to be based on a license plate misread by the pursuing officer's mobile computer. The Pattersons had been face down on the asphalt for 6 minutes before the error was discovered. Their 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9, had watched from the back seat while officers screamed commands with weapons drawn. The officers had been exonerated. The plate number had genuinely been similar to a vehicle wanted in connection with an armed robbery 2 counties over, but the Pattersons had filed their complaint anyway, asking only that the department review its felony stop procedures and consider the trauma inflicted on children who'd done nothing except ride in a car with parents whose only crime was driving while black in the wrong jurisdiction. The review had never been conducted. The complaint had been ruled without merit, filed, and forgotten. Denise stood on the sidewalk where the Pattersons' car had been stopped, reconstructing the scene from photographs included in the complaint file. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across pavement that looked like any other pavement in any other American suburb, indistinguishable from the road where her father had died, except for the decade and the details. By late afternoon, she had documented 11 of the 17 locations. The patterns were consistent with the complaints, clustered around the same 3 deputies, the same sergeant, the same internal affairs lieutenant, whose job appeared to be ensuring that nothing stuck, rather than determining whether anything should. Deputy Cole Renfro appeared in 9 complaints, Sergeant Marcus Wynn in 7. Lieutenant Bo Prescott had investigated all 47 and found merit in exactly 0. Sergeant Lydia Vance supervised most of the stops in question, her name appearing on incident reports with the regularity of someone who understood that presence at controversial encounters created opportunities to control narratives. And presiding over all of it, aware of none of it, or complicit in all of it depending on one's interpretation. Sheriff Dale Ashford, 4-term incumbent, running unopposed in 3 of his 4 elections because no one in Barton County saw sufficient reason to challenge the status quo. Denise sat in her rental car in the parking lot of a closed elementary school, reviewing her notes while daylight faded toward dusk. The assessment was essentially complete, patterns confirmed, evidence documented. The recommendation she would make to her superiors at the Pentagon would be unambiguous. Refer the matter to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for formal investigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 104-141, the statute that authorized federal intervention when law enforcement agencies demonstrated patterns or practices of constitutional violations. She pulled out her secure phone, encrypted, government-issued, routed through servers that didn't appear on any commercial carrier's network, and dialed the number she'd memorized before leaving Arlington. Assessment complete. Her voice was clipped, professional, the tone of 1,000 briefings delivered in 1,000 secure facilities over a quarter-century of service. Patterns consistent with the complaints. Recommending formal referral to DOJ Civil Rights Division. The voice on the other end acknowledged, asked standard questions about her status, her timeline, her extraction plan. Negative on extraction support, driving back tonight, should cross the county line by 2200 hours. Should. A word that implied contingency, that acknowledged the space between plan and execution, that left room for the universe to intervene with complications no one could predict. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the gathering darkness, watching the empty playground across the parking lot. Swings moving slightly in the evening breeze. Slide catching the last of the daylight. A space designed for children's laughter, silent now except for the sound of her own breathing and the distant hum of traffic on a highway she couldn't see. Her father had been 34 when he died. She had been 12, old enough to understand death and young enough to believe the explanations offered by adults who'd known they were lying. Accidental discharge during suspect noncompliance. Tragic circumstances regrettably beyond anyone's control. A finding rubber-stamped by an internal affairs process that had taken 72 hours from shooting to closure. She was 47 now, older than he'd ever been, wearing stars he'd never earned, serving a nation he'd also served, asking questions he'd never had the chance to ask because someone had stopped his asking with a bullet that everyone pretended had been an accident. Denise started the rental car's engine, checked her mirrors, pulled onto the road that would take her out of Barton County and back to a life where her rank meant something, where her authority was recognized, where the color of her skin was less likely to trigger the particular calculations currently running in the minds of deputies she'd been documenting all day. At 9:41 p.m., 6 miles from the county line, she signaled a lane change. The blinker clicked 3 times. She counted automatically, the way she counted everything, before she merged left to pass a slow-moving pickup truck whose driver didn't acknowledge her existence. At 9:43 p.m., red and blue lights bloomed in her rearview mirror. She pulled over within 400 feet, well within the standard established by Georgia traffic law. Hazards activated. Engine off. Interior dome light on. Hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, visible through windows she hadn't had time to tint because this was a rental and rentals came as they came. These weren't reactions. They were protocols. The physical manifestation of briefings she'd attended, and briefings she'd delivered, and statistics she'd compiled from her desk at the Pentagon, statistics about what happened when black service members were stopped by law enforcement in jurisdictions where their uniforms meant nothing and their skin meant everything. The cruiser sat behind her for 4 minutes. She watched the clock on her dashboard count each second, knowing that 4 minutes was not standard. Standard was 60 to 90 seconds. Run the plates, check for warrants, approach the vehicle. 4 minutes meant something else was happening. 4 minutes meant radio calls being made, questions being asked, decisions being reached before anyone had spoken a word to the person sitting in the car they'd pulled over. When the deputy finally approached, he came from the passenger side. Tactical positioning, the manual called it. Approach from an unexpected angle to keep the driver off balance, to establish control before contact, to communicate through geography that this encounter would proceed on police terms rather than civilian terms. His flashlight was already on, the beam sweeping her interior before he reached the window. She watched it pass over her purse on the passenger seat, her leather notebook, the rental agreement she'd already placed on the dashboard for exactly this situation. License and registration. Keep your hands where I can see them. She had already retrieved them. Held them at window height, clearly visible, positioned so his camera, if his camera was functioning, would capture the compliance. He took them without acknowledgement, returned to his cruiser. 4 more minutes passed. When he came back, his tone had changed, harder now, more certain. The voice of someone who'd decided something during those 4 minutes and now intended to act on that decision regardless of what the person in the car did or said. Ma'am, you failed to signal your lane change at least 100 feet before the intersection, Georgia Code 46123. She knew the statute, had reviewed it specifically during her preparation, along with every other traffic law that might serve as pretext for the kind of stop she was now experiencing. The actual language of 40-6-123 required continuous operation of the turn signal, not a specific distance, a distinction that mattered legally but rarely mattered practically in encounters like this one. I believe the statute requires continuous operation of the signal, not a minimum distance. The correction was mild, factually accurate, the kind of observation any citizen with a smartphone and 30 seconds could have verified. but his jaw tightened as though she'd challenged not just his interpretation of traffic law, but his fundamental authority to interpret anything at all. "Ma'am, I've been enforcing traffic law for 6 years. I know what the statute says." 6 years. Younger than she'd estimated. Probably 27, maybe 28. The gym-defined build of someone who spent more time lifting weights than reading case law. The confidence of someone who'd never been seriously questioned and didn't understand why anyone would start now. "I understand, Deputy. For my records, may I have your badge number and the case number for this stop?" Standard request, legally protected under the First Amendment, required by Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Policy 1.12, which mandated that officers provide identification information upon request during traffic stops. The kind of thing a citizen might know from Google, or from watching too many legal dramas, or from briefing documents prepared by military attorneys who specialized in encounters exactly like this one. His hand moved to his belt, not to retrieve a card or check his badge, to a different location entirely, where metal clicked against metal in the darkness. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why?" "Because I told you to." No probable cause articulated. No reasonable suspicion stated. Just a command delivered with the certainty of someone who'd given similar commands many times before and never been questioned about their legal basis. She opened her door slowly, stepped out with her hands visible at her sides. The October air had cooled since sundown, carrying the smell of pine and distant agriculture and something else. Ozone, maybe, the particular scent that preceded thunderstorms or confrontations. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle." "Deputy, I'd like to understand what I'm being detained for." "You're being detained because you won't stop talking." Won't stop talking. The phrase that appeared in complaint after complaint in her assessment file. The characterization that transformed citizens asking questions into suspects resisting authority. The words that justified escalation when escalation served purposes that had nothing to do with public safety. His radio crackled. A woman's voice, professional but carrying an edge that suggested familiarity with the deputy, perhaps something more than professional. "Unit 14, status check. You've been on that stop for 11 minutes. 10-4. Got a difficult one here. Might need backup." Difficult. The second word that appeared repeatedly in the complaints. Difficult meant uncooperative. Uncooperative meant resistant. Resistant meant force could be justified. She watched the second cruiser's lights appear in her peripheral vision, growing larger as they approached. Backup arriving for a traffic stop involving a lane change violation that hadn't actually occurred, and a request for badge numbers that was constitutionally protected. The machinery was in motion now. Whatever happened next would happen according to protocols developed over years of similar encounters, protocols designed to produce predetermined outcomes, regardless of what the person being stopped actually did. Denise kept her hands visible, kept her breathing steady, and began, silently, to document. The second cruiser pulled to a stop behind the first, angling to block any hypothetical escape route a cooperative citizen might hypothetically attempt. The officer who emerged moved with the deliberate confidence of command, her uniform bearing sergeant's stripes that caught the flashlight beams as she approached. Lydia Vance was 41 years old, a 15-year veteran whose marriage to County Commissioner Harold Vance provided both social standing and political protection that appeared nowhere in her personnel file but informed every decision she made. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that tone could be weaponized as effectively as physical force. "Evening, ma'am. Deputy Renfro says we're having some difficulty with compliance." "I've complied with every lawful order, Sergeant. I requested a badge number, which is protected speech under the First Amendment." The sergeant's smile emerged slowly, a practiced expression that conveyed patience while communicating its opposite. The smile of someone who'd learned that pleasantness could be a weapon, that courtesy could mask contempt, that helping could mean destroying. "Ma'am, when an officer asks you to do something, the appropriate response is yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, not a civics lesson." "I wasn't offering a civics lesson. I was stating a legal fact." "And now you're arguing. which suggests to me that you might be the kind of person who argues about everything." Vance circled the rental sedan slowly, her flashlight probing the interior through closed windows. The beam paused on the leather notebook sitting on the passenger seat, lingered there for several seconds before moving on. "What's in that notebook?" "Personal notes." "Mind if we take a look?" "I don't consent to any searches." The words emerged precisely as she'd practiced them, legally appropriate, clearly stated, impossible to misinterpret as anything other than the invocation of Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure, and completely irrelevant, as she knew they would be, to what happened next. "Ma'am, I'm detecting the odor of marijuana emanating from your vehicle." There was no odor. The rental had been cleaned that morning. She had the receipt in her wallet, time-stamped and specific. The car smelled like industrial air freshener and rental company disinfectant, and nothing else, certainly not the particular botanical scent that officers in jurisdictions like this one had learned to claim whenever they needed probable cause that couldn't be disproven. "There is no marijuana in this vehicle. I do not consent to any searches." "Your consent isn't required, ma'am. Probable cause." The deputy, Renfro, the sergeant had called him, opened the driver's door without waiting for further authorization. His partner had arrived during the exchange, a third officer whose unit number she hadn't caught, but whose face she recognized from complaint photographs. Deputy Marcus Wynn, 34 years old, subject of 9 excessive force allegations, and the suspected source of anonymous tips that seemed to precede controversial arrests with remarkable frequency. Wynn positioned himself between her and the road, his body blocking any camera angle that might capture what his colleagues were doing inside her vehicle. Professional obstruction, the kind that could be explained as tactical positioning if anyone ever asked, which no one ever would because the people who might ask were the same people who had taught the technique in the first place. Renfro emerged from the car holding her notebook. He flipped through pages while Sergeant Vance watched, his flashlight beam illuminating entries she had written that morning. Times, dates, locations, GPS coordinates, complaint numbers corresponding to the assessment she had nearly completed. "Sarge?" Renfro's voice had changed, uncertain now, almost concerned. "She's been photographing locations around the county. Times and dates logged. These coordinates match the wind stop from 21. This one's the Delgado site." Vance's expression shifted. The practiced pleasantness evaporated, replaced by something sharper, something that calculated rather than performed. "Ma'am, who are you working for?" "I'm not required to answer that question." "No, but it would help your situation considerably if you did." "What situation?" "I was stopped for an alleged lane change violation." The third cruiser arrived without warning. No lights, no siren, just headlights appearing around a curve and decelerating with the smooth control of someone who'd known exactly where to find this stop. The man who emerged wore lieutenant's bars on his collar and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone whose authority extended beyond traffic enforcement. Bo Prescott was 52 years old, the department's internal affairs liaison, and the architect of 47 complaint dismissals over 3 years. His background included a brief stint with the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, ended under circumstances that remained sealed, but clearly hadn't prevented him from finding subsequent employment. He dressed better than his salary justified, drove a car nicer than a lieutenant's pension should afford, and walked toward her with the unhurried stride of someone who understood that power meant never having to rush. "Sergeant Vance, deputy, what do we have?" Vance handed him the notebook. Prescott's eyes moved across the pages with the recognition of someone who'd encountered documentation before, who understood what it meant when outsiders took notes this detailed about operations they had no official reason to investigate. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Prescott. I handle internal matters for the department." His voice was smooth, almost friendly, the tone of someone offering assistance rather than issuing warnings. "These notes suggest you've been conducting surveillance on official police operations." "I've been visiting locations in a public county. That's not surveillance. That's tourism." "Tourism with GPS coordinates and complaint file numbers?" She didn't answer. Let the silence sit between them, filling the space his question had created with nothing but night sounds and the idle of multiple cruiser engines. This story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. Hit that like button if you're ready for what happens next. Georgia Code 161139. Prescott recited the statute number from memory, the casual fluency of someone who'd used it before. Criminal surveillance. And 16-993, criminal invasion of privacy. You could be looking at felony charges, ma'am. Unless you'd like to explain who sent you. The statutes were real. She knew them, had reviewed them during preparation, understood their actual scope and application. Neither covered photographing public buildings or recording times and dates in a personal notebook. But legal accuracy wasn't the point. Pressure was the point. Fear was the goal. I'd like to contact an attorney. You're not under arrest yet, just detained for investigation. No attorney required. Then I'm free to leave? No, you're detained pending investigation. Under what authority? Prescott's smile was thin, patient, the expression of someone who'd played this game many times and never lost. My authority. Deputy Wynn appeared at Prescott's shoulder, his voice low but audible. LT, dispatch says the sheriff wants a status update. Tell him we've got a situation. Someone's been documenting department operations. Could be media, could be worse. Wynn's eyes found hers across the small distance separating them. Something flickered there. Not recognition exactly, but calculation, assessment, the look of someone fitting a new piece into a puzzle he'd been working on longer than tonight. Want me to run her through federal databases, see if she pops anywhere? Federal databases. The request was irregular. Local deputies typically accessed state systems, not federal. But Prescott nodded, and Wynn returned to his cruiser to make queries that shouldn't have been available to him, but apparently were. 3 minutes passed. 5. The night insects maintained their chorus, indifferent to the drama unfolding on this stretch of rural highway. The farmhouse half a mile distant had turned off its porch light, either from disinterest or deliberate ignorance. When Wynn emerged, his expression had changed. The confident calculation was gone, replaced by something closer to alarm, the face of someone who'd found more than he'd expected and wasn't sure what to do with the discovery. LT. His voice carried a new tension. You should probably make that call to the sheriff yourself. Prescott's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that Wynn's statement had landed as intended. He stepped away from the group, pulling out his phone, his conversation conducted in tones too low to overhear, but his body language broadcasting growing concern. Whatever Wynn had found in those federal databases, it had changed the temperature of this encounter. Not enough to end it. Too much had already happened. Too many officers were now invested in outcomes that justified their presence, but enough to create uncertainty where certainty had ruled minutes before. Prescott returned to the group with his phone still in hand. His face had composed itself into professional neutrality, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Ma'am, you're being placed under arrest for obstruction of official police business. Georgia Code 16-10-24. The statute covered interference with law enforcement through physical action, false statements, or active obstruction. Asking questions and declining to explain personal notes had never been successfully prosecuted under 16-10-24, and anyone with legal training knew it. But arrests didn't require successful prosecution. They only required an officer's decision, and Prescott had decided. I'd like that arrest documented on your body cam, Lieutenant, including your stated probable cause. Prescott's hand moved to his chest, to the mount where his body cam should have been positioned. The indicator light was dark. Had been dark, she now realized, since his arrival. Equipment malfunction, he would call it later. A coincidence that his recording device had failed on the exact night when recording would have documented actions he couldn't defend. Equipment malfunction. Deputy Renfro, secure the suspect. The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. Tighter than necessary, the metal edges pressing into bone with the particular pressure that came from force, applied with intention rather than procedure. Renfro pulled her arms back sharply, A small violence, the kind that wouldn't leave marks visible in photographs, but would ache for days afterward. She didn't resist, didn't tense against the restraints or attempt to turn toward her accuser. Resistance was grounds for additional charges, additional force, additional narrative. She had watched enough body cam footage, when body cam footage existed and hadn't been conveniently corrupted, to understand how quickly compliance could be recharacterized as resistance when the people writing the reports were the same people applying the force. I am not resisting. Her voice remained level, projected clearly toward wherever cameras might be recording, despite their operators' preferences. I am complying with your arrest. I am noting the time, 11:07 p.m. Renfro guided her toward his cruiser with more force than necessary, his hand on her upper arm pressing against pressure points that sent pain signals racing up her shoulder. The backseat door opened. The interior smelled of disinfectant and something older. Fear, accumulated over years of similar encounters, absorbed into vinyl that remembered even when official records did not. Through the partition, she heard Prescott issuing orders. Pull her rental to the impound lot. I want that notebook logged as evidence. And Marcus, make sure your cam footage from tonight gets filed properly. Already handled, LT. Equipment malfunction. Happens all the time. Equipment malfunction. Happens all the time. The phrases that appeared in 14 of the complaint files she'd reviewed, the explanation that Internal Affairs accepted without apparent skepticism, because skepticism would require investigation, and investigation would require acknowledging patterns that everyone preferred to ignore. The cruiser pulled onto County Road 12, heading away from the county line she'd been 6 miles from crossing, away from the life where her rank meant something, toward a detention facility where she would be processed as a suspect, her credentials confiscated, her authority rendered meaningless by a system designed to render certain people meaningless regardless of what credentials they carried. She counted the turns, left onto Highway 41, right onto Industrial Drive, straight for 2 miles past the auto parts store where PFC Delgado's jaw had been broken and the witnesses had watched from across the street. The geography of injustice, laid out in asphalt and distance, each landmark a reminder that what was happening to her had happened before and would happen again unless someone documented thoroughly enough and pushed hard enough and survived long enough to force change. The Barton County Detention Facility occupied a building that had been temporary when it was constructed in 1987 and remained temporary in the way government structures remained temporary, permanently, without upgrades, until someone finally allocated money that no one wanted to spend on facilities housing people no one wanted to acknowledge. Processing happened in a room with fluorescent lights that buzzed at irregular intervals, and a camera in the corner whose indicator light, she noted with unsurprised recognition, was also dark. They photographed her against a wall marked with height measurements. Fingerprinted her at a station whose ink pad had seen better decades. Confiscated her phone, her watch, her wedding ring, each item logged by a booking officer named Tillman, who moved through the process with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd stopped seeing the people attached to the property long ago. Prescott appeared during booking, holding a laminated card that any defense attorney would recognize. The Miranda warning, required before custodial interrogation, a formality that suggested charges were coming and the questioning would proceed regardless of her answers. Ma'am, I'm going to read you your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them? I understand. I invoke my right to remain silent and my right to an attorney. Invocation. The word that should have ended questioning, that legally required officers to cease interrogation on any topic covered by the invoked rights. But legal and actual operated on different frequencies in facilities like this one, where the gap between procedure and practice was wide enough to swallow careers and lives. Noted. Prescott's acknowledgement carried no intention to comply. Now, would you like to tell us who you're working for? She said nothing, kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral, her silence as complete as the darkness outside the windows that faced nothing but parking lot and pine forest. Your silence isn't helping your situation. We're going to find out who you are, and when we do, whatever deal might have been available won't be on the table anymore." Still nothing. Let him threaten. Let him promise and warn and attempt to leverage fear into cooperation. Her silence was protected now, legally unbreakable, and her silence was also strategy, because the longer they operated without knowing who she was, the more documentation they generated, the more evidence they created of exactly the patterns she had been sent to assess. They placed her in a cell that measured 8 feet by 10. Concrete block walls painted institutional green at some point in the previous century. Metal bench without mattress. Toilet in the corner without partition or privacy. The particular architecture of dehumanization, designed to remind occupants that they had forfeited personhood by entering this space. She was alone in this wing, the only detainee at this hour, isolated from anyone who might witness her treatment or corroborate her account. The isolation was intentional. People talked when they had no witnesses, no solidarity, no one to perform strength for. At 12:15 a.m., footsteps approached. Sergeant Vance appeared at the cell door, her expression carrying something new, not the practiced pleasantness of the traffic stop, but genuine uncertainty, the face of someone whose script had encountered unexpected complications. "Should know something. We ran your plates through every database we can access. Virginia registration comes back to Enterprise Rental. Credit card trace shows the reservation was made by something called DoD Administrative Services." Vance paused, letting the weight of those 3 letters settle between them. "Want to tell me what that means?" DoD, Department of Defense. A designation generic enough to cover civilian contractors, administrative staff, logistics personnel, or something else entirely. Something that would explain the calm, the documentation, the refusal to fold under pressure that should have folded most people hours ago. She said nothing, just watched Vance's face as understanding tried to form and failed, as pieces almost connected before falling apart again. "Silent treatment won't help you, ma'am. We're patient people, and you're not going anywhere until we figure out who you are." Vance's radio crackled, dispatch relaying a message that pulled her attention away from the cell door. "Sergeant Vance, Sheriff Ashford is requesting an immediate status briefing at the main facility. He says it's urgent." Vance's expression shifted again. Something was moving that she didn't control, forces activated by queries that had returned results nobody had expected. "Sit tight, ma'am. Looks like things are about to get interesting." Footsteps retreated down the corridor. The overhead light continued its irregular buzzing, and in the cell where she had been placed to wait for outcomes others would determine, Denise Hartwell began composing the report she would deliver when this night finally ended, a report that would include timestamps and badge numbers and the exact words spoken by officers who didn't know they were building the case against themselves. Sheriff Dale Ashford had occupied his office for 14 years, 4 consecutive elections, each won by larger margins than the last. He believed in his department the way certain people believed in institutions, not with evidence, but with faith that required no evidence, that persisted despite evidence, that treated questioning as betrayal rather than necessary oversight. The briefing in his office at 1 a.m. included Prescott, Vance, and the department's contract attorney, a man named Whitfield whose hourly rate exceeded most deputies' daily wages and whose primary function was ensuring liability remained someone else's problem. DoD. Ashford repeated the acronym as though saying it enough times might change its meaning. Department of Defense DoD. That's what the database trace indicates, sir. What exactly has she been documenting? Vance handed him the notebook they'd seized. Evidence now, logged and cataloged, but not yet reviewed by anyone who understood what its contents represented. Locations, times, GPS coordinates matching complaints filed against the department, the Wynn stop, the Delgado arrest, the Patterson felony stop, others. Those complaints were all ruled unfounded. Yes, sir, they were. Prescott's confirmation carried no inflection, no acknowledgement that his own investigations had produced those rulings, no recognition that someone might view 47 unfounded complaints as a pattern rather than a series of coincidences. Whitfield spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured caution of someone paid to anticipate problems before they became catastrophes. "Sheriff, if this woman is connected to a federal agency, we have significant exposure. False arrest claims against federal employees carry enhanced penalties under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, and if her documentation was authorized by whatever agency she works for, authorized by whom? For what purpose?" "That's what concerns me, sir. DOD doesn't randomly send people to photograph Sheriff's Department operations. This suggests prior complaints at the federal level. Military families, maybe. Someone with enough standing to trigger federal interest." Ashford's hand moved toward his desk phone, then stopped. The gesture captured his dilemma perfectly. The instinct to seek guidance from above colliding with the reality that above meant people who might view his department's actions as problems to be solved rather than decisions to be supported. At 2:17 a.m., while Sheriff Ashford debated strategy with lawyers whose meters ran regardless of conclusions, Deputy Marcus Wynn sat alone in the evidence processing room with 3 body cam units arranged before him. Renfro's camera, Vance's camera, his own. 3 devices that should have captured everything that happened during the stop: the commands, the statements, the probable cause that didn't exist, the arrest that couldn't be legally justified. 3 recordings that would create problems if they ever reached eyes outside this department. The evidence management system, purchased in 2019 after a state grant made refusal politically difficult, included a feature that most users never discovered: administrative override for corrupted files. A backdoor written into the software by developers who understood that customers sometimes needed flexibility that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Wynn typed the entry that would appear in the official record: BWC footage from Units 14, 22, and 31 for Incident 2024-10-14-2347, experienced synchronization failure during upload, original files corrupted, backup not available, IT ticket submitted for system review. 3 cameras, 1 incident, 0 footage. The deletion took 11 seconds. 11 seconds to erase hours of documentation, to convert evidence into absence, to ensure that whatever happened next would happen without the inconvenience of visual record. What Wynn didn't know, what none of them knew, because the contract had been signed by a predecessor who'd since retired and the technical specifications had been filed without review, was that the 2019 system upgrade included automatic cloud backup, a redundancy feature buried in the vendor agreement, enabled by default, never disabled because no one had realized it existed. The footage Wynn deleted from local storage still existed on a server 2,000 miles away, time-stamped and cataloged and waiting for someone with proper authorization to request it. In her cell, Denise sat with her spine straight against the wall. She hadn't asked for water or food or access to a phone, because asking would require acknowledging dependence on people who'd demonstrated their indifference to her rights and welfare. She could wait. She had waited before, in places far more dangerous than this, for durations far longer than a single night. At 2:43 a.m., new footsteps approached, different cadence than the others, hesitant, almost deferential, a sound that didn't match the confident authority that had characterized every other approach tonight. A young deputy appeared at the cell door, early 20s, face still carrying the softness of someone not yet hardened by years of choices that required hardening. His name tag read Oates. In his hands, a paper cup of water held at chest height like an offering. "Ma'am?" His voice carried uncertainty that bordered on apology. "The sheriff asked me to check if you need anything." "Ma'am." Not the dismissive ma'am she'd heard from Renfro and Vance, the title deployed as diminutive, stripped of respect. This ma'am carried weight, the way junior personnel addressed senior personnel when they'd been warned about rank they couldn't see but had been told existed. "What's your name, deputy?" "Oates, ma'am. Jeremy Oates." "Deputy Oates, I'd like to make a phone call. Georgia law entitles detained persons to reasonable access to communication." Yes, ma'am. I'll ask the sergeant." He backed away from the door with the water still in his hand, as though he'd forgotten why he'd come. Something had changed. The sheriff was asking about her comfort. A junior deputy was addressing her with deference that exceeded professional courtesy. Information was moving through channels she couldn't see, reaching conclusions she couldn't predict. At 3:04 a.m., they brought her to a processing room with a landline phone mounted on the wall. Prescott supervised, standing close enough to hear anything she said. A violation of attorney-client privilege if she were calling counsel, but she wasn't calling counsel. She dialed 11 digits from memory. Not a civilian exchange, not any exchange that would appear in commercial directories or standard databases. A number that existed in very few records and required very specific authentication to access. 3 rings, then a voice, male, professional, carrying the particular formality of someone answering during hours when most calls meant crisis. Duty officer? This is Sierra 7. Authentication. Foxtrot Lima 4729. I need an immediate status relay to TJAG. TJAG. The Judge Advocate General of the United States Army. The highest-ranking military attorney in the branch, reporting directly to the Secretary of the Army and through him to the Secretary of Defense. Prescott's face drained of color so quickly the change was visible even in fluorescent lighting. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words emerged. The confident authority that had defined his presence all night evaporated, replaced by the particular paralysis of someone recognizing that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Confirmed, Sierra 7. The duty officer's response was immediate, efficient, utterly unconcerned with whatever local drama might be unfolding around the caller. Location and situation? Barton County, Georgia, detention facility. Unlawful arrest during authorized assessment operation. Request legal intervention through DOD channels and notification to DOJ Civil Rights Division per Memorandum of Understanding dated March 2023. The language was dense, procedural, precisely calibrated, the vocabulary of military administration and federal coordination that meant nothing to people outside those systems and everything to people within them. Copy all, Sierra 7. Relay initiated. Stand by for callback at this location. The line disconnected. Denise set down the receiver and turned to face Prescott. Lieutenant, I'd suggest you wake your sheriff. He's going to want to be present for what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed because this reveal is going to change everything about what you thought this story was. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. Sheriff Ashford had been summoned from his home, arriving in civilian clothes with the disheveled appearance of someone who'd been sleeping when calls started coming that couldn't wait until morning. He stood beside Prescott and Whitfield as Denise answered, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and the dawning recognition that tonight's events had exceeded any scenario his departmental training had prepared him for. Ms. Hartwell, this is Colonel James Okonkwo, Office of the Staff Judge Advocate. The voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to delivering consequential information. I have General Morrison from Army Inspector General on the line, as well as counsel from DOD General Counsel's office. Please confirm your status. Colonel, I'm being unlawfully detained at the Barton County Sheriff's Department detention facility. I was arrested during an authorized assessment operation. My credentials are in my vehicle, which was impounded at an unknown location. Another voice joined the call, deeper, commanding, the tone of someone who'd led combat operations and congressional briefings and didn't distinguish between the two in terms of authority. Sheriff Ashford, are you present on this call? Ashford's voice emerged strained, uncertain. Yes. Who is this? This is Major General Thomas Morrison, United States Army Inspector General's office. You have in your custody Brigadier General Denise Hartwell, who is conducting an authorized civil rights assessment of your department at the request of the Department of Defense. You will release her immediately and preserve all evidence related to her arrest. Any failure to comply with these instructions will be treated as obstruction of federal investigation. General. The word hung in the air like a verdict, reshaping everything it touched. Ashford's face went gray. Prescott physically stepped backward, as though distance might protect him from implications he was only beginning to understand. General? Ashford's voice cracked on the word. She's a general? Brigadier General Hartwell has served 26 years in the United States Army. She currently leads the Inspector General's Civil Rights Assessment Division. For the past 18 months, she has been documenting civil rights complaints filed by military families stationed in proximity to your jurisdiction. Tonight's operation represented the culmination of that assessment. 18 months. The duration landed on Prescott with visible impact. 18 months of assessment, meaning 18 months of documentation, 18 months of pattern analysis, 18 months of building a case that culminated in tonight's encounter. Everything that had happened since 9:43 p.m. was evidence now, generated by a department that hadn't known it was creating the record of its own violations. Denise spoke, her voice unchanged from the cell, from the processing room, from every moment of this night. Sheriff Ashford, your department has received 47 excessive force complaints in 3 years. All 47 were ruled unfounded by Lieutenant Prescott's Internal Affairs Division. 3 of those complaints were filed by active duty service members or their dependents. Under the Memorandum of Understanding between DoD and DOJ, that pattern triggers mandatory federal review. Another voice joined the call, female, sharp, carrying the particular authority of lawyers who worked at federal levels. This is Miriam Kessler, Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice. Sheriff Ashford, effective immediately, your department is under federal investigation pursuant to 42 U.S.C. Section 12141, Pattern or Practice of Civil Rights Violations by Law Enforcement. Section 14141. The statute that had transformed Ferguson and Baltimore and Chicago, that authorized federal oversight extending for years, that could dismantle departments brick by brick and rebuild them under judicial supervision. The legal mechanism that everyone in law enforcement knew about and everyone in law enforcement hoped would never apply to them. You will preserve all records, all communications, all evidence related to the complaints identified in the DoD assessment, Kessler continued. Any destruction of evidence from this point forward will be treated as obstruction of justice under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Any officer who participated in tonight's arrest will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Those are not requests. Colonel Okonkwo's voice returned with additional information. Sheriff, DoD Counsel is transmitting the full evidence package to your department email as we speak. This package includes body cam footage retrieved from your department's cloud backup system, footage that Deputy Wynn reported as corrupted approximately 90 minutes ago. The color drained from Prescott's face entirely. The cloud backup. The redundancy system nobody knew existed because nobody had read the vendor contract closely enough. The footage Wynn had deleted locally still existed on servers that DoD had already accessed through channels that local administrators couldn't block. We have 3 complete recordings of tonight's traffic stop. Timestamp 9:47 p.m., Deputy Renfro's initial contact. Timestamp 10:03 p.m., Sergeant Vance's arrival and the false claim of marijuana odor. Timestamp 10:19 p.m., Lieutenant Prescott's arrival and the discussion of, and I quote directly from the audio, making that notebook disappear before anyone starts asking questions. Making the notebook disappear. The words Prescott had spoken to Wynn, thinking no one else could hear, thinking the absence of functioning body cams meant the absence of records. The words now documented, time-stamped, attributed, included in federal evidence packages being transmitted to servers that would preserve them regardless of what happened in this room. Ashford lowered himself into a chair that happened to be nearby, his legs apparently unwilling to support weight that had suddenly increased beyond their capacity. What? His voice faltered. He tried again. What happens now? Now? General Morrison's voice carried finality that brooked no negotiation. Now you release General Hartwell with a full apology and pray that her assessment doesn't recommend criminal referrals in addition to the civil rights investigation. Now you place every officer involved in tonight's incident on administrative leave. Now you cooperate fully with federal investigators who will arrive at your facility within hours. And now you begin preparing your department for the kind of scrutiny that should have prevented tonight's events from ever occurring. They returned her property at 4:43 a.m. Phone. Watch. Wedding ring. The leather notebook that Prescott had hoped would disappear, its pages intact, its documentation undisturbed. Renfro stood in the corner of the processing room, his face blank in the way faces go blank when their owners are watching their careers collapse in real time. The confident aggression of the traffic stop had evaporated, replaced by the particular stillness of someone calculating how bad this was going to get and arriving at numbers that exceeded his ability to process. Vance was absent, summoned to Ashford's office to discuss her role in events that would define her remaining time in law enforcement. Prescott sat at a desk, signing paperwork that officially released a prisoner who had never been lawfully detained. His signature representing acknowledgement of mistakes he would spend years trying to minimize. The release documentation read, "Charges dismissed. Obstruction of official police business. Georgia Code 16-1024. Reason: insufficient probable cause." Insufficient probable cause. Bureaucratic language designed to suggest misunderstanding rather than malice, error rather than pattern, isolated failure rather than systematic abuse. Language that would appear in reports and press releases and official statements. Language that told a story different from the one the body cam footage would tell when federal investigators began their review. Denise signed where indicated, accepted her copy, looked at Prescott one final time. "Lieutenant, for the record, your body cam was inactive from 10:19 p.m. to 11:47 p.m. 88 minutes of missing footage during a custodial arrest. Under your own department's policy, General Order 412.3, Section C, failure to maintain active recording during custodial encounters requires immediate supervisory review and potential disciplinary action. I trust you'll include that violation in your incident report." Prescott didn't respond, just pushed the release form across the desk and turned away, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who had run out of words that might improve his situation and had decided silence was safer than speech. At 8 a.m., the Department of Justice issued a press release announcing the pattern or practice investigation. Local media, alerted by sources inside the department, who recognized that controlling narrative now required getting ahead of federal revelations, had gathered at the courthouse where a hastily arranged press conference was about to transform everything Barton County thought it knew about its sheriff's department. General Hartwell stood at the podium in her Class B uniform, the first time her rank had been visible since she'd crossed the county line 32 hours earlier. 2 silver stars on each shoulder, service ribbons representing deployments and commendations, and 26 years of achievements that the people who'd arrested her hadn't known existed and hadn't bothered to imagine. Beside her stood Miriam Kessler from DOJ and Captain Terrence Odom from Army Criminal Investigation Division, their presence communicating federal authority that local politics couldn't override. Kessler spoke first, her words carried by microphones to reporters whose questions were already forming. The Department of Justice has opened a pattern or practice investigation into the Barton County Sheriff's Department. Evidence gathered over 18 months suggests systematic violations of constitutional rights, including unlawful arrests, excessive force, and destruction of evidence. We are committed to ensuring that all residents of Barton County, including the military families who serve our nation, receive equal protection under the law. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed with the particular intensity reserved for stories that would lead evening broadcasts. But Denise's eyes found someone else in the crowd. Her cousin Yvonne, standing at the back, tears streaming down a face that had waited 35 years for this moment without knowing it would ever arrive. Not justice. Not yet. The investigation would take months. The outcomes would be partial, the accountability incomplete, the reforms contested by unions and lawyers and politicians whose interests required the system to remain as it was. But this was a beginning, a foundation, proof that patterns could be documented, and documentation could force change, even when the people benefiting from those patterns controlled the mechanisms that should have prevented them. General Denise Hartwell stepped to the microphone, the cameras capturing her face, her uniform, the stars that represented authority her accusers hadn't believed existed in someone who looked like her. 35 years ago, my father was killed during a traffic stop on a road 6 miles from where I was arrested last night. His name was Ronald James Hartwell. He was 34 years old. He was a deputy in this very department, serving a community that needed him in ways the people who killed him never understood. The crowd went silent. Even the reporters stopped their shouting, recognizing that something beyond press release and official statement was about to be said. His death was ruled accidental discharge during suspect non-compliance. The investigation lasted 72 hours. No one was ever held accountable. And for 35 years, my family has lived with questions that no one in this county wanted to answer. She paused, letting the words settle over the assembly, like the weight they carried. Last night, I was handcuffed on a public road for asking a deputy's badge number. I was arrested for exercising constitutional rights that protect every citizen of this county. I was detained in a facility where evidence was destroyed, and cameras were disabled, and officers discussed making my documentation disappear. Her voice hardened slightly, carrying the particular authority of someone who'd given orders in situations far more dangerous than a press conference. That stops today. The investigation announced this morning will examine not just last night's events, but the 18 months of complaints that preceded them, the 47 excessive force allegations that were ruled unfounded, the evidence that disappeared, the witnesses who were never interviewed, the patterns that everyone in this department knew about, and no one in this department stopped. She looked directly into the cameras, knowing that her words would reach audiences far beyond this parking lot, this county, this state. My father's case is being reopened as well. Whatever happened on that road in 1989 will finally be examined by investigators who have no interest in protecting the people who may have been responsible. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice demanded, and I intend to see it delivered. Questions exploded from the press corps about timelines, about specific officers, about what the investigation would examine, and what outcomes it might produce. But Denise stepped back from the microphone, yielding the space to Kessler and Odom, whose job was answering questions while her job was asking them. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from Colonel Okonkwo. DOJ formally requesting reopening of Deputy Ronald Hartwell case, October 1989. Original finding of accidental discharge under federal review. 35 years, 12 hours in custody, 1 phone call to the Pentagon. And finally, the questions she'd been asking since she was 12 years old might receive answers. Not victory, not yet. Victory would require trials and convictions and accountability that systems designed to protect themselves would resist at every stage. But progress. Movement. The particular satisfaction of knowing that her presence in this county, her documentation of its patterns, her survival of its attempts to silence her, had accomplished something that 35 years of silence had never achieved. The press conference continued around her, officials delivering statements and reporters demanding details, and cameras capturing everything for audiences that would view tonight's news with the particular attention reserved for stories that confirmed suspicions they'd always harbored about systems they'd always distrusted. And in the crowd, Yvonne caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture that communicated everything words couldn't convey about family and loss, and the long arc of justice that bent only when people seized it and forced the bending. The work wasn't finished, it was only beginning, but beginning was everything when nothing had ever begun before. The press conference ended at 9:17 a.m., but the machinery it had set in motion was only beginning to accelerate. Within hours, federal vehicles bearing DOJ and Army CID insignia rolled into Barton County with the particular inevitability of forces that local politics could not redirect. They established operations in the county courthouse, a deliberate choice, occupying the symbolic center of local authority with federal presence that announced jurisdiction had shifted, whether anyone welcomed the shift or not. Denise remained in the county for 3 additional days, not as a detainee, but as a witness whose testimony would anchor the investigation she had triggered. The motel room she occupied cost $67 per night and smelled of industrial cleaner and decades of travelers whose stories had long since departed with them. She spent those days in conference rooms, answering questions from investigators who treated her account with the professional respect her accusers had denied, documenting every moment of the traffic stop in language precise enough for courtroom presentation. The leather notebook had been copied, scanned, and entered into federal evidence systems that would preserve its contents regardless of what happened to the original. Every GPS coordinate she had recorded now corresponded to a location federal investigators would visit. Every timestamp she had logged now anchored a timeline that would be reconstructed from multiple sources. Every complaint number she had referenced now represented a case file that would be examined by people whose careers depended on finding truth rather than burying it. On the second day, Miriam Kessler from the DOJ Civil Rights Division sat across from her in a borrowed conference room. Legal pads spread between them, a recorder capturing every word for transcription. "General Hartwell, I need to understand the scope of what you documented. Your notebook references 47 complaints, but your assessment report suggests patterns extending beyond those specific incidents." Denise opened the leather cover, turning to a page dense with her precise handwriting. "The 47 complaints represent documented allegations that resulted in formal filings, but patterns don't exist in isolation. For every complaint filed, experience suggests 3 to 5 incidents that were never reported. Victims who feared retaliation, who didn't know how to navigate the system, who assumed filing would accomplish nothing because previous filings had accomplished nothing. You're suggesting the actual scope of violations could be significantly larger than documented." "I'm suggesting that what I documented represents the visible portion of something that extends below the surface. The complaints I referenced share common elements. The same officers appearing repeatedly, the same internal affairs investigator ruling repeatedly that nothing warranted discipline, the same supervisory chain that should have identified patterns and instead perpetuated them." Kessler made notes, her pen moving across paper with the efficiency of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews and knew which details would matter when cases moved from investigation to prosecution. "Tell me about Lieutenant Prescott. His name appears in connection with every complaint that was ruled unfounded." "Bo Prescott handles internal affairs for the department, has for 7 years. Before that, he served briefly with the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, separation under circumstances that remained sealed but clearly didn't prevent subsequent employment. His investigation methodology appears consistent across all 47 complaints: minimal witness interviews, narrow interpretation of evidence, conclusions that consistently favor the accused officers. You're suggesting his investigations were designed to produce predetermined outcomes." "I'm stating that 47 consecutive unfounded findings in a department with the complaint volume Barton County generates represents a statistical improbability that warrants examination. Either Lieutenant Prescott is the most fortunate internal affairs investigator in Georgia, encountering only complaints without merit, or his methodology produces outcomes disconnected from actual merit." Kessler's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she had reached similar conclusions through different paths. "The body cam footage from your arrest, the footage Deputy Wynn deleted locally but which existed on cloud backup, we've reviewed it. The content is consistent with your account, but I want to understand something. When Lieutenant Prescott arrived at the scene, he discussed making your notebook disappear. Do you believe that conversation was spontaneous, or does it suggest established practice?" Denise considered the question with the particular care she applied to assessments whose conclusions would shape subsequent actions. "During the 90 minutes between my arrest and my phone call, evidence was deleted from 3 separate body cam units. That level of coordinated action suggests either spontaneous conspiracy among officers who happen to share identical instincts, or established protocols that officers knew to implement when circumstances required evidence to disappear. Given the patterns in the complaint files, patterns where footage repeatedly became unavailable during controversial encounters, I believe the latter explanation is more consistent with observed behavior." The interview continued for 4 more hours, moving through timelines and personnel and the specific mechanisms through which a department could transform from public protection into public threat. By the time it ended, Kessler had filled 3 legal pads with notes, and the recorder had captured documentation that would anchor federal proceedings for months to come. That evening, Yvonne arrived at the motel with food from the Magnolia Diner, the same establishment where they had shared breakfast before the world shifted on its axis. They ate in the small room with its worn carpet and humming air conditioner, cousins whose lives had diverged decades ago but whose family remained the constant that geography and career could not sever. Mama called. Yvonne's voice carried weight that went beyond casual conversation. She's been watching the news, saw you at that press conference in your uniform, said you looked just like Daddy. The comparison landed with force that Denise hadn't anticipated. Her father's face existed in her memory as a fixed image, 34 years old forever, preserved in photographs that couldn't age, in memories that childhood had filtered into something approaching mythology. She was 47 now, older than he had ever been, wearing stars he had never earned, fighting battles he had never been permitted to finish. Does she know they're reopening his case? I told her this morning. She cried for an hour. Not sad crying, something else, like something that had been stuck for 35 years finally came loose. Denise set down her fork, appetite diminished by the weight of conversations that food couldn't accompany. The original investigation ruled his death accidental discharge during suspect noncompliance. 72 hours from shooting to closure. No witnesses interviewed except the officer who fired. No ballistics analysis beyond confirmation that the bullet came from a service weapon. No consideration of alternative explanations. You've read the file? I requested it through federal channels 2 years ago. What I received was 12 pages of administrative closure language and 43 pages of redactions. Whatever actually happened that night, someone ensured the documentation wouldn't reveal it. Yvonne leaned forward, her expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who had lived with unanswered questions for decades. The officer who shot him, do you know who it was? Deputy Samuel Renfro Sr. He retired in 1994 with full pension. Died in 2019 of natural causes. Never faced any consequences, never answered any questions, never acknowledged that anything requiring acknowledgement had occurred. Renfro. The name sat between them like something toxic. The deputy who arrested you last night. Cole Renfro, Samuel's grandson. 3 generations of the same family, in the same department, on the same roads. The coincidence was too precise to be coincidental, too patterned to represent chance. Whatever had happened to Ronald Hartwell in 1989 had produced consequences that echoed forward through decades, shaping a department that had learned certain lessons about accountability and applied those lessons to ensure accountability never arrived. Do you think they knew? When they stopped you, do you think they knew who you were, whose daughter you were? I don't know. My name wouldn't have meant anything to someone Cole Renfro's age, but names get passed down in departments like this. Stories get told. Maybe someone mentioned the Hartwell shooting when training new deputies, as an example of how to handle situations that required handling. Maybe my father's death became a lesson in what the department could survive when it chose to protect its own. Yvonne reached across the small table, her hand covering Denise's in a gesture that communicated solidarity words couldn't express. Whatever you need, whatever this investigation requires. This family has waited 35 years for someone to ask the right questions. We'll wait as long as it takes for the answers. The federal investigation proceeded with the particular momentum of machinery that, once activated, could not be easily stopped. Within the first week, 4 officers were placed on administrative leave pending individual case reviews. Deputy Cole Renfro, Sergeant Lydia Vance, Lieutenant Bo Prescott, and Deputy Marcus Wynn. The leaves were paid, union contracts required compensation during investigation, but the public nature of the announcement communicated consequences that salaries couldn't offset. Sheriff Dale Ashford held a press conference 3 days after the DOJ announcement, his prepared statement reading like a document that lawyers had revised 17 times before permitting him to deliver it. The Barton County Sheriff's Department is fully cooperating with federal investigators. We are committed to transparency, accountability, and the highest standards of professional conduct. The events of October 14th do not represent the values of this department or the dedicated men and women who serve our community. The statement acknowledged nothing, admitted nothing, promised nothing specific. It was the language of institutional preservation, designed to create the appearance of cooperation while committing to nothing that might later be used as evidence of prior knowledge or culpability. If this investigation has you hooked, hit that subscribe button. The next phase of this story reveals just how deep the corruption runs. Denise returned to Arlington on October 18th, her assessment officially complete, her role shifting from field investigator to witness whose testimony would be called upon as proceedings advanced. The Pentagon corridors felt different after 72 hours in a rural Georgia detention cell. The same fluorescent lights, the same institutional architecture, but carrying new weight now that she had experienced what happened when institutional authority was wielded by people who viewed it as personal property rather than public trust. Her office on the third floor of the Inspector General's building contained the accumulated documentation of a career spent identifying problems and recommending solutions. Filing cabinets held reports from bases across the country, assessments of everything from procurement irregularities to leadership failures to the civil rights patterns that had become her specialty. On her desk, positioned where she would see it every morning, sat a framed photograph of her father in his deputy's uniform, the image she had carried since childhood, the face she had inherited, the legacy she had spent 26 years trying to honor. General Morrison, her commanding officer, summoned her to his office on October 21st for a debrief that extended beyond professional assessment into territory that touched the personal. Denise, the DOJ investigation is proceeding according to their timeline, not ours. But I want you to understand something about the parallel track we're pursuing. Morrison was 61 years old, a 3-star general whose career had included combat commands and Pentagon politics in roughly equal measure. He understood how systems worked because he had spent decades navigating systems, and he understood how systems failed because he had spent those same decades watching them fail. The reopening of your father's case isn't just about one shooting in 1989. It's about establishing whether patterns we've documented in contemporary complaints extend backward through department history. If the same methodology that produced 47 unfounded findings in 3 years produced a 72-hour closure in your father's death, that's relevant to the federal investigation. You're suggesting the investigation will examine department culture across decades, not just recent incidents. I'm suggesting that DOJ counsel has already requested records extending back to 1985. They're looking for patterns that predate current personnel, patterns that suggest institutional rather than individual failure. Your father's case provides a data point 3 decades removed from current events. If similar methodology appears across that span, it strengthens the argument for systemic intervention rather than targeted discipline. The implications settled over Denise with weight that exceeded their immediate meaning. Her father's death might finally be examined not as isolated tragedy, but as evidence of patterns that had persisted across generations. The same department that had killed him had arrested her. The same family whose grandfather had fired the shot had handcuffed her on a road 6 miles from where her father bled out. History didn't repeat, but its echoes were deafening to anyone who listened carefully enough. 6 weeks after the October arrests, the Department of Justice released preliminary findings from its pattern or practice investigation. The document ran 147 pages and represented the most comprehensive external examination of the Barton County Sheriff's Department in its history. The language was precise, measured, carrying the particular weight of conclusions that lawyers had reviewed for accuracy and defensibility. But beneath the bureaucratic careful phrasing, the findings were damning. The investigation identified systemic deficiencies in use of force reporting, evidence preservation, and internal accountability mechanisms. Analysis of complaint files revealed consistent patterns: minimal investigation, narrow evidence review, and predetermined conclusions that favored accused officers, regardless of complaint merit. The 47 excessive force complaints filed between 2021 and 2024 were reviewed using independent methodology. Of those 47, investigators determined that 31 presented credible allegations that warranted disciplinary consideration. The department's Internal Affairs Division found merit in 0 of those 31 cases. 0 of 31. The number crystallized everything the assessment had suggested and the investigation had confirmed. An accountability system designed to produce absence of accountability, operating with such consistency that its outcomes could be predicted before investigations began. The findings continued with specificity that named patterns, while carefully avoiding naming individuals whose cases had not yet been adjudicated. Evidence analysis revealed systematic destruction of body cam footage during controversial encounters. Of the 47 complaints reviewed, 19 involved incidents where footage was reported corrupted, unavailable, or destroyed due to equipment malfunction. Technical review of the department's evidence management system indicated that 13 of those 19 deletion events were executed using administrative override functions rather than automatic system failures. The pattern of deletions corresponded consistently with encounters that generated external complaints, suggesting deliberate destruction rather than technical malfunction. Deliberate destruction, the phrase that elevated evidence loss from negligence to obstruction, from mistake to crime. Whoever had implemented those overrides, and the investigation strongly implied that whoever was Deputy Marcus Wynn, had not simply failed to preserve evidence. They had actively destroyed it, knowing that destruction served purposes that preservation would not. The report's recommendations outlined a path forward that would transform the department, whether it welcomed transformation or not. Based on documented patterns, the Department of Justice recommends negotiation of a consent decree establishing federal oversight of the Barton County Sheriff's Department. This decree should include mandatory body camera policies with independent evidence storage, restructured internal affairs procedures with external review authority, comprehensive retraining on use of force standards and constitutional policing, and civilian oversight mechanisms with investigative authority. Implementation should be supervised by a federal monitor for a period of not less than 5 years. 5 years of federal oversight. The timeline represented transformation that would outlast any single sheriff, any individual officer, any administration that might prefer returning to previous practices. 5 years of external scrutiny, mandatory reporting, and the particular accountability that came from knowing federal eyes were watching every decision. Local reaction divided along predictable lines. The police union issued a statement defending its members and questioning federal methodology. County commissioners expressed concern about costs associated with compliance. Sheriff Ashford, in his first public statement since the initial press conference, announced that he would not seek re-election when his current term ended in December, a retirement that preserved his pension while avoiding the political impossibility of campaigning under federal investigation. After 22 years of service to Barton County, I have decided to step down and allow new leadership to guide the department through this challenging transition. I remain proud of the men and women who serve this community and confident that the department will emerge stronger from this process. The statement said nothing about the 47 complaints, the destroyed evidence, the systematic failures that had triggered federal intervention. It acknowledged nothing, apologized for nothing, accepted responsibility for nothing. It was the language of departure without accountability, of retreat without consequence, of survival achieved through strategic withdrawal. 3 months after the October arrest, the first federal indictment was announced. The defendant, Lieutenant Bo Prescott, charged with deprivation of rights under color of law pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and destruction of evidence pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. The charging document outlined specific allegations with the precision that federal prosecution required. Between January 2021 and October 2024, Defendant Prescott, acting under color of law as Internal Affairs Liaison for the Barton County Sheriff's Department, systematically conducted investigations designed to produce predetermined outcomes favoring accused officers. Defendant's methodology included failure to interview available witnesses, narrow construction of evidence to exclude information unfavorable to accused officers, and coordination with evidence management personnel to ensure that recorded footage documenting alleged violations would be unavailable for review. The indictment detailed 6 specific complaints where Prescott's investigation had demonstrably ignored evidence that contradicted his conclusions. 6 families who had filed complaints believing the system might deliver justice, whose allegations had been dismissed through processes designed to produce dismissal regardless of merit. Prescott's attorney issued a statement describing the charges as politically motivated overreach, federal intrusion into local law enforcement decisions that prosecutors in Washington couldn't understand. The defense previewed arguments that would eventually be tested in court. That internal affairs decisions involved judgment calls that federal law couldn't second-guess, that unfounded findings didn't prove corruption, that patterns could be coincidental rather than conspiratorial. The trial was scheduled for the following July, 9 months away, the particular timeline of federal prosecution that ground slowly, but ground exceedingly fine. Deputy Cole Renfro resigned from the department in January, 2 weeks before his administrative leave was scheduled for formal review. His resignation letter, obtained through public records request, contained 14 words. I hereby resign my position with the Barton County Sheriff's Department, effective immediately. No explanation, no acknowledgement, no recognition that anything requiring acknowledgement had occurred. Within 8 weeks of his resignation, Renfro had secured employment with a private security firm based in Savannah, a firm whose client list included gated communities and corporate facilities whose residents and managers apparently found his background unobjectionable. The revolving door between public law enforcement and private security absorbed him as it had absorbed thousands of officers whose careers ended in circumstances that prevented continued public service, but didn't prevent continued employment. This is far from over. Hit that like button if you believe accountability should follow these officers wherever they go. Sergeant Lydia Vance faced internal discipline rather than criminal charges. The evidence supporting her participation in the traffic stop insufficient for prosecution, but sufficient for administrative consequence. She was demoted to patrol deputy, stripped of supervisory authority, reassigned to a district on the county's western edge, where her presence would generate minimal public attention. Her husband, County Commissioner Harold Vance, publicly criticized the demotion as excessive punishment for an officer whose only crime was following standard procedure. His comments, reported in the local newspaper, suggested that political consequences might accompany the professional ones. Commissioners who publicly defended officers under federal investigation rarely found that defense rewarded by voters who had watched the same investigations unfold. Deputy Marcus Wynn's case resolved through negotiation rather than trial. Federal prosecutors, prioritizing the Prescott prosecution and conserving resources for cases with clearer evidentiary paths, offered a plea agreement: guilty to misdemeanor failure to maintain official records, 12 months probation, no jail time, permanent bar from law enforcement employment. Wynn accepted. The plea hearing lasted 11 minutes. The judge who accepted it noted that the agreement reflected the defendant's cooperation with ongoing investigations, cooperation that presumably included testimony about who had instructed him to delete footage, who had established the protocols he followed, who had created the systems he implemented. The cooperation meant Wynn's testimony might appear in subsequent proceedings, his knowledge of departmental practices potentially valuable in prosecutions that extended beyond his individual actions. Someone had taught him how to delete evidence. Someone had established the administrative override procedures he used. Someone above him in the chain of command had created expectations that certain footage would disappear when circumstances required disappearance. That someone remained unindicted, their identity presumably known to investigators, but not yet subject to charges that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The machinery of accountability moved slowly, and those who operated it understood that patience produced better outcomes than speed. The consent decree negotiations extended through winter and into spring, the particular complexity of federal oversight requiring agreement on details that would govern departmental operations for years. The county resisted provisions it characterized as intrusive: civilian review authority, independent evidence storage, mandatory reporting requirements that would increase administrative burden. DOJ counsel pushed for provisions that would ensure meaningful oversight rather than cosmetic reform. The final agreement, signed in April, represented compromise that satisfied neither party entirely, the particular outcome of negotiations, where both sides possessed leverage neither could fully deploy. Federal oversight would continue for 7 years, rather than the 5 DOJ had initially recommended. A monitor appointed by the court would review all excessive force complaints with authority to recommend disciplinary action that the department would be required to consider, though not required to implement. Body cam footage would be stored on servers outside departmental control, accessible to investigators without requiring departmental cooperation. Civilian oversight board members would be appointed jointly by the county commission and the DOJ, their authority advisory rather than binding, but their presence ensuring external eyes on operations that had previously occurred in darkness. The decree didn't fix everything. Consent decrees never fixed everything. They established frameworks within which change could occur if the people operating within those frameworks wanted change to occur. They created accountability structures that made certain outcomes more difficult to produce, certain patterns more difficult to perpetuate. But they didn't transform human nature or eliminate the impulses that had created the patterns in the first place. What they did accomplish was visibility. For 7 years, everything the Barton County Sheriff's Department did would be examined by people whose careers didn't depend on the department's reputation, whose promotions weren't controlled by the department's leadership, whose conclusions couldn't be predetermined by the department's culture. 7 years was long enough for an entire generation of officers to be hired, trained, and promoted under different expectations. Long enough for institutional memory to shift, for what had been normal to become unacceptable, for what had been acceptable to become unthinkable. Whether that transformation would actually occur depended on factors the consent decree couldn't control: the character of future sheriffs, the priorities of future officers, the vigilance of future communities who would need to continue demanding accountability long after federal monitors departed. Progress, not victory. The distinction mattered to anyone who understood how institutional change actually worked. Slowly, incompletely, requiring sustained pressure that most reform efforts couldn't sustain. The investigation into Ronald Hartwell's 1989 death proceeded on a parallel track, its timeline measured in months rather than weeks, its conclusions requiring the particular care that cases involving deceased suspects and deceased witnesses demanded. The original file contained 12 pages of documentation and 43 pages of redactions. Federal investigators, operating under authority that local records custodians couldn't obstruct, obtained the unredacted versions, documents that had been sealed for 35 years, their contents presumably known to someone but protected from the family whose patriarch had died, and from the public whose tax dollars had funded the investigation that declared his death accidental. Denise received copies of the unredacted documents in late March, delivered by courier to her Pentagon office in an envelope bearing DOJ insignia and classification markings that indicated contents requiring secure handling. She read them alone, in her office, with the door closed and the photograph of her father positioned where she could see his face while she learned what had actually happened to him. The original incident report, now fully visible, documented a traffic stop at 9:47 p.m. on October 3, 1989. Deputy Samuel Renfro had stopped Deputy Ronald Hartwell's personal vehicle for an alleged equipment violation, a broken taillight that subsequent investigation never confirmed. The stop had occurred on County Road 12, 6 miles from the county line, at a location where the nearest witness would have been the farmhouse half a mile distant whose residents reported hearing what they believed to be a backfire around 10 p.m. The report described escalation: Hartwell allegedly reaching for something in his vehicle, Renfro allegedly fearing for his safety, a shot fired that struck Hartwell in the chest and killed him before medical assistance could arrive. But the unredacted portions revealed details the original summary had concealed. Hartwell had been off-duty that evening, driving home from a meeting at the county courthouse where he had filed a formal complaint against 3 officers, including Renfro, for what he characterized as systematic targeting of black motorists in traffic enforcement. The complaint, a copy of which appeared in the unredacted file, documented patterns that would become familiar to his daughter 3 decades later. Stops without legal justification, searches without consent or probable cause, force applied to citizens whose only offense was questioning the authority of officers who had stopped them. Ronald Hartwell had been investigating his own department, had been documenting patterns that his superiors preferred undocumented, had been asking questions that threatened careers and challenged assumptions and demanded accountability that the system had no intention of providing. And 6 hours after filing that complaint, he was dead. The ballistics analysis, which the original summary had described as confirming only that the bullet came from a service weapon, actually documented inconsistencies that the investigating officer had dismissed without explanation. The trajectory suggested Hartwell had been shot while seated, not while reaching or moving. The powder burns on his uniform suggested close range, closer than defensive shooting typically produced. The position of the spent casing suggested the shooter had been standing at an angle inconsistent with Renfro's account of approaching from the driver's side. None of these inconsistencies had been investigated. The report noted them, then concluded that they didn't warrant additional inquiry given Renfro's account of events and the absence of witnesses who could contradict that account. 72 hours. That's how long the investigation had lasted. 72 hours to close the case of a deputy killed while filing a complaint against the officer who killed him. 72 hours to decide that the ballistics inconsistencies didn't matter, the complaint timing didn't matter, the patterns Ronald Hartwell had documented didn't matter. The investigation had been conducted by Lieutenant William Prescott, Bo Prescott's father, the same family that had produced the internal affairs investigator who buried 47 complaints had produced the investigator who buried the complaint Ronald Hartwell died trying to file. 3 generations of Renfros in the same department. 2 generations of Prescotts protecting them. Patterns extending across decades, perpetuating themselves through family and culture and institutional memory that transmitted certain understandings from one generation to the next. Denise set down the documents and looked at her father's photograph. 34 years old in that image, wearing the uniform he believed represented something worth serving, asking questions he believed deserved answers. He had been right about the patterns, had been right about the department, had been right about the officers whose conduct he documented, and being right had killed him. The DOJ's formal finding on the Hartwell case arrived in May, 7 months after the investigation began. The conclusion, delivered in the measured language of federal documentation, represented as much accountability as 35 years of distance permitted. Based on review of contemporaneous documentation, ballistics analysis, and contextual evidence, including the timing of Deputy Hartwell's formal complaint against the officer who subsequently shot him, the Department of Justice concludes that the original finding of accidental discharge lacks evidentiary support. The investigation identifies significant procedural failures including inadequate witness canvassing, dismissal of ballistics inconsistencies without documented justification, and conflict of interest in assignment of investigating officer, whose familial relationship to subsequent department personnel suggests improper influence on investigative outcomes. The finding stopped short of declaring the shooting murder. The evidence, degraded by 3 decades and the deaths of key participants, couldn't support that conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. But it rejected the accidental discharge finding. It documented the procedural failures. It named the conflict of interest that had shaped the original investigation. The Department of Justice recommends that the state of Georgia formally vacate the 1989 finding of accidental discharge in the death of Deputy Ronald Hartwell and issue a posthumous acknowledgement that his death was not adequately investigated. Additionally, the department recommends that the Hartwell family receive formal apology from the Barton County Sheriff's Department for the investigative failures that prevented justice in this matter. Formal apology, posthumous acknowledgement. The bureaucratic mechanisms available when criminal prosecution was impossible and civil liability had long since expired. Not justice in the sense that justice implied consequences for those responsible, but recognition, acknowledgement that something wrong had happened and that wrongness had been concealed for 35 years by people whose job was revealing rather than concealing. The state of Georgia accepted the recommendation in June. The formal vacation of findings occurred through administrative process, paperwork that transformed official record from accidental discharge to inadequate investigation. The language was careful, legally precise, drafted by attorneys who understood that even acknowledgments of wrongdoing carried liability implications. The apology came from the interim sheriff who had replaced Ashford, a woman named Patricia Reeves, no relation to the judge who had presided over preliminary hearings, appointed by the county commission to lead the department through its transition period. Her statement was read at a public meeting attended by Denise, by Yvonne, by their mother, Elaine, who had waited 35 years to hear anyone in authority acknowledge what she had always known. On behalf of the Barton County Sheriff's Department, I apologize to the Hartwell family for the failures that prevented adequate investigation of Deputy Ronald Hartwell's death. Deputy Hartwell served this community with distinction and courage. He died while attempting to hold this department accountable for practices that failed the citizens we are sworn to protect. His death was not adequately investigated, and his family was denied the answers they deserved. That failure represents a profound breach of the trust this department exists to uphold. The words filled a room that had fallen completely silent, observers understanding they were witnessing something rare. Institutional acknowledgement of institutional failure, delivered without qualification or deflection. We cannot change what happened 35 years ago. We cannot restore what was taken from this family, but we can commit to ensuring that the patterns Deputy Hartwell documented, the patterns that may have contributed to his death, do not continue to define this department. That commitment is the only meaningful response we can offer to a wrong that official apology cannot remedy. Elaine Hartwell, 81 years old, had risen from her seat in the front row. Her voice carried the particular weight of decades spent carrying knowledge that no one would acknowledge. My husband was a good man. He believed in the law. He believed the law protected everyone, not just some people. He died because he tried to make that belief real. She paused, her eyes finding Denise in the audience. My daughter has spent her whole life trying to finish what her father started. I hope she lives to see it finished. I hope we all do. The meeting ended without the customary procedural business, the agenda items that would normally follow public comment suspended in recognition that some moments required space rather than continuation. Outside, in the parking lot where June heat radiated from asphalt that had absorbed a full day of Georgia sun, Denise stood with her mother and her cousin, 3 women whose lives had been shaped by a death that had finally received the acknowledgement decades had denied. It's not enough. Yvonne's voice carried frustration that official apology couldn't address. Nobody's going to prison. Nobody's losing their pension. An apology doesn't mean anything without consequences. Consequences require living defendants. Denise's response carried the weariness of someone who had studied enough cases to understand the limitations of posthumous justice. Samuel Renfro died in 2019. William Prescott died in 2011. The people directly responsible are beyond any accountability the legal system can provide. So they just got away with it. All of them. They killed Daddy, and they got away with it. Elaine spoke before Denise could respond, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had carried grief longer than anyone else present. They didn't get away with it. They lived with it. Every day for the rest of their lives they knew what they had done. They woke up every morning knowing they had killed a good man because he tried to do the right thing. That's not getting away with it. That's a different kind of prison, one without bars, but without escape either. She turned to face the building they had just exited, the county courthouse that had witnessed her husband's final attempt at accountability and now housed the offices that would implement accountability's long-delayed arrival. And now everyone knows. The federal government knows. The state knows. This community knows. Whatever story they told themselves about that night, whatever justification they constructed, it's been exposed. They're dead now, but their names are attached to findings that say they were wrong. Their families know. Their descendants know. That matters. Maybe not as much as prison would matter, but it matters. Denise watched her mother's face, seeing in its lines the particular expression of someone who had reached a conclusion that permitted forward movement after decades of stasis. "Mama, are you okay?" "I'm better than I've been in 35 years." Elaine's hand found Denise's, her grip stronger than her 81 years might suggest. "Your father would be proud of you. He would be proud of what you've done, what you've built, what you've accomplished. He would be proud that his daughter became a general, while his killers became nothing but footnotes in federal investigation files. They stood together in the parking lot as evening approached, three women connected by loss that had finally found acknowledgement, by questions that had finally received answers, by a death that had finally been recognized as something other than accident. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that persistence can eventually break through even the thickest walls of institutional silence. The following months brought developments that mixed progress with frustration, the particular rhythm of institutional change that moved in irregular pulses rather than steady advancement. Lieutenant Prescott's trial commenced in July as scheduled. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks, during which federal prosecutors presented evidence documenting his systematic approach to complaint dismissal, witness statements ignored, evidence narrowly construed, conclusions predetermined. Defense attorneys argued that internal affairs investigations required judgment calls that federal law couldn't second-guess, that unfounded findings reflected honest disagreement about evidence rather than corrupt determination to protect officers at any cost. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on the first count, deprivation of rights under color of law, and guilty on the second count, destruction of evidence. The sentencing, conducted 6 weeks later, produced a term of 42 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release and permanent prohibition from law enforcement employment. 42 months. 3.5 years, the particular arithmetic of federal sentencing guidelines that balanced severity against precedent, that accounted for cooperation, Prescott had provided none, and remorse, Prescott had expressed none, and the guidelines that constrained judicial discretion regardless of what circumstances might suggest appropriate. Prescott's attorneys announced immediate appeal. The appellate process would extend for years, the particular deliberation of higher courts that reviewed trial records for error and occasionally found it. Whether Prescott would ultimately serve his sentence, whether appeals would succeed or fail, whether the verdict would survive the scrutiny of judges who had never sat in the trial courtroom, all of that remained uncertain. What was certain was the verdict itself. Guilty. A federal jury had examined the evidence and concluded that a police officer had systematically violated the rights of citizens he was sworn to protect. The precedent mattered regardless of what happened on appeal. The signal mattered to other officers in other departments who operated similar systems with similar assumptions about what they could get away with. The consent decree implementation proceeded on its own timeline, each provision generating friction that required resolution before the next could be addressed. The new sheriff, Patricia Reeves, navigated the competing demands of federal monitors, union representatives, county commissioners, and community members, whose expectations varied so widely that satisfying any group meant disappointing others. Body cam footage storage transferred to external servers in August. The transition generated protests from officers who characterized external storage as evidence of distrust, as presumption of guilt, as federal overreach into local operations. The protests were noted, documented, and ignored. The footage would be stored where officers couldn't access it with administrative overrides, where deletion required federal authorization that federal monitors would never provide. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first meeting in September, 7 members appointed through the joint process the consent decree specified. Their authority was advisory. They could recommend but not require, suggest but not compel. But their presence meant that complaints would be reviewed by people whose careers didn't depend on the department's reputation, whose promotions weren't controlled by the people they were examining. Whether that presence would produce different outcomes remained to be seen. Advisory authority could be ignored by departments determined to ignore it. Recommendations could be rejected by sheriffs who preferred previous practices. The structure created possibilities. Whether those possibilities would be realized depended on factors no consent decree could control. Denise followed developments from Arlington, receiving weekly updates through channels that kept her informed without requiring her continued presence. Her assessment was complete. Her testimony had been delivered. Her role in what happened next was observer rather than participant. The new assignment arrived in October, 1 year after her arrest, 1 year after the night that had accelerated everything that followed. Another department, another state, another pattern of complaints that suggested systematic rather than isolated failure. The work continued regardless of individual cases, regardless of individual outcomes, regardless of how any particular investigation concluded. She studied the briefing materials in her Pentagon office, the leather notebook on her desk joining the photograph of her father as artifacts of a career spent asking questions that powerful people preferred unanswered. Fort Mitchell, South Carolina. 17 complaints from military families in 2 years, 12 ruled unfounded by internal investigation. Patterns that looked familiar because patterns of institutional failure tended to look familiar, the particular shapes that emerged when accountability systems were designed to produce absence rather than presence of accountability. Another one. Her aide, Captain Terrence Odom, set additional files on her desk. DOJ is requesting joint assessment under the same MOU framework. Military families stationed nearby, civilian law enforcement with complaint patterns that suggest review is warranted. Timeline? They'd like preliminary findings within 6 months, full assessment within 12. 6 months to document, 12 months to conclude. The particular rhythms of federal investigation moved neither by urgency nor by delay, proceeding at the pace that evidence required and bureaucracy permitted. Have we coordinated with local command? Fort Mitchell's provost marshal is aware of the request. He's supportive, says his office has been receiving the same complaints we have, and local law enforcement has been unresponsive to military liaison attempts. Unresponsive. Another word that appeared frequently in complaint patterns, describing departments that viewed external inquiry as intrusion rather than accountability, that interpreted questions as challenges rather than opportunities to demonstrate professionalism. Denise opened the briefing folder, reviewing the complaint summaries that would guide initial inquiry. Private First Class Angela Morrison, 22 years old. Traffic stop for alleged speeding that witnesses reported as fabricated. Removed from vehicle, searched without consent, detained for 4 hours before release without charges. Staff Sergeant Jerome Williams and his wife Denise, the coincidence of shared names noted without comment, stopped during a family drive to church, questioned about vehicle ownership despite presenting registration, children traumatized by officers who approached with weapons drawn for reasons that were never explained. Specialist Carlos Reyes, 24 years old, arrested for disorderly conduct during a dispute with a neighbor, held for 3 days despite the neighbor's refusal to press charges, released only after military attorneys intervened on his behalf. Patterns. Familiar patterns. The particular shapes that emerged when certain people wearing certain uniforms encountered certain other people in certain jurisdictions where belonging was assumed for some and questioned for others. When do they want me on site? Next month, ideally. Preliminary reconnaissance before full assessment team deploys. 1 year after Barton County. 1 year after the traffic stop that had produced federal investigation, consent decree, criminal prosecution, and the reopening of a case 35 years cold. 1 year after the night that had nearly ended differently, that could have ended with her name added to lists of citizens whose encounters with law enforcement produced tragedy rather than accountability. She had survived, had documented, had triggered consequences that, while incomplete, exceeded what most such encounters produced. The system had worked, eventually, imperfectly, through mechanisms that required her particular credentials and connections to activate. But the system didn't work for everyone. Didn't work for the Angela Morrisons and Jerome Williams and Carlos Reyes, whose encounters generated complaints that went nowhere, whose documentation produced nothing, whose persistence accomplished nothing because they lacked the particular leverage that federal investigation required. That was why the work continued. Not because any individual case could fix systemic failure, but because accumulating cases created pressure that systems couldn't indefinitely resist. Each assessment documented patterns. Each documentation created record. Each record contributed to weight that eventually, sometimes, produced movement that individual complaints alone could not. Schedule the reconnaissance for November. Denise closed the folder, her decision made. And pull the full complaint files for all 17 cases. I want to review them before deployment. Yes, ma'am. Odom departed, leaving her alone with the briefing materials and the photograph and the leather notebook whose pages documented what Barton County had tried to conceal. She turned to a fresh page, wrote the date, the location, the case reference numbers she would need for the work ahead. The same precise notation she had used in Barton County, the same methodology that had produced evidence federal investigators could use. The work continued. The patterns persisted. The questions remained. But so did the people asking them. The telephone rang at 6:47 p.m., the particular sound of her secure line that indicated calls routing through channels most communication never touched. Hartwell. General, this is Agent Kessler, DOJ. I wanted you to hear this before the formal notification arrives. Miriam Kessler's voice carried something Denise hadn't heard in their previous conversations. Not quite excitement, but something approaching satisfaction. We've identified the source of a document that appeared in Prescott's files during discovery. An email from 6 months before your arrest. Subject line referenced upcoming assessment. The sender was redacted at state level, but we've traced the original through federal server logs. Who sent it? County Commissioner Harold Vance, Lydia Vance's husband. He received a tip from someone at the State Law Enforcement Liaison Office that federal assessment activity was being planned for departments in his region. He forwarded that information to Prescott with instructions to, and I'm quoting directly here, make sure the house is clean before company arrives. The revelation landed with weight that exceeded its immediate implications. A county commissioner warned through state channels about federal activity, passing that warning to the officer responsible for ensuring complaints remained unfounded. Coordination between political authority and law enforcement accountability systems, designed to ensure accountability never arrived regardless of what patterns existed. What are the charges? Obstruction of federal investigation, conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights. We're also examining whether his wife's involvement in your arrest constitutes additional exposure, but that's still developing. Harold Vance, the commissioner whose public criticism of his wife's demotion had suggested political consequences for those who held officers accountable. The elected official whose campaign contributions had flowed from interests that benefited from law enforcement that asked no questions and answered none. The machinery extended further than anyone had initially understood, not just a department with problematic officers, but a network connecting political authority, law enforcement, state agencies, and the particular arrangements that transformed public institutions into private protection. When will you announce? Indictment is expected next week, but I wanted you to know before it becomes public. Your assessment exposed more than we initially realized. The patterns you documented didn't exist in isolation. They were protected by structures that extended well beyond the department itself. What about the state liaison who provided the initial tip to Vance? Under investigation, but state officials are harder to prosecute than local ones. Different jurisdictional complications, different political protections. That piece may take longer to develop, if it develops at all. The particular frustration of accountability that reached some targets and missed others. The reality that any investigation, however thorough, eventually encountered boundaries that prosecution couldn't cross, protections that couldn't be overcome, calculations that concluded prosecution wasn't worth the resources required. Thank you for letting me know, Agent Kessler. Thank you for the documentation, General. Without your assessment, none of this would have been possible. The complaints existed before you arrived. The patterns existed before you arrived. But the evidence that allowed prosecution, that came from your work. The call ended. Denise sat in the gathering evening light of her office, processing implications that extended beyond any individual prosecution. Commissioner Vance's indictment wouldn't fix the system. The state liaison's investigation, if it proceeded, might never produce charges. The patterns would persist in departments where no federal assessment was conducted, in jurisdictions where no general happened to be driving through, in communities where complaints accumulated without anyone powerful enough to force examination. But this case had produced something. Criminal conviction for Prescott, forced resignation for Renfro, demotion for Sergeant Vance, consent decree for the department, indictment for the commissioner, acknowledgement for her father. Not everything, not enough. but more than nothing. More than the zero accountability that 47 complaints had produced before federal intervention forced different calculations. Progress. The word kept returning because alternatives, victory, success, resolution, implied completions that institutional reform never achieved. Progress meant movement in the right direction. Progress meant pressure that made wrong behavior harder. Progress meant consequences that existed even when they fell short of justice. Progress would have to be enough. Not because it satisfied, but because demanding perfection before acknowledging progress meant never acknowledging anything, never recognizing that incremental change accumulated into transformation over timelines that exceeded individual cases, individual careers, individual lives. Her father had died seeking progress. The patterns he documented had persisted for 35 years after his death, but they were being addressed now, examined now, reformed now, however incompletely, however imperfectly. That mattered, not as much as his life would have mattered, but it mattered. Denise looked at his photograph one final time before gathering her materials for departure. 34 years old in that image, forever young, forever frozen in the moment before the questions he asked became too dangerous to survive. "I'm still asking," she said quietly to the photograph. "Different department now, different state, same patterns, same questions, same work." She turned out the light and left, the leather notebook in her bag, the new assignment awaiting her attention, the work continuing because the work always continued for anyone willing to do it. The drive home took 43 minutes through Arlington traffic that moved in pulses governed by traffic signals and human impatience. She used the time to review mental notes about Fort Mitchell, about the 17 complaints awaiting examination, about the patterns that would likely emerge when examination began. Her apartment waited with the particular silence of space occupied by someone who spent most waking hours elsewhere. The mail included the formal DOJ notification Kessler had previewed, Commissioner Vance's indictment, scheduled for announcement the following week, the latest development in a case that kept producing developments long after she had expected it to conclude. She set the notification aside and opened her laptop to review the Fort Mitchell briefing materials one more time. 17 complaints, 12 ruled unfounded, 5 pending investigation that internal documentation suggested would also be ruled unfounded. Patterns. The same patterns. The particular shapes that emerged when accountability systems served purposes other than accountability. An email notification appeared. Subject line: Re-DOD Assessment Request, Fort Mitchell, SC. The sender was the Fort Mitchell Provost Marshal, confirming coordination for her November reconnaissance visit. General Hartwell, local authorities have been notified of federal interest in complaint patterns. Per standard protocol, we informed the Sheriff's Department that assessment activity would be conducted, without specifying timeline or methodology. Initial response was defensive but not hostile. Recommend proceeding with caution but without delay. The sooner documentation begins, the less opportunity for evidence management. Evidence management. The polite term for what had happened to body cam footage in Barton County, what happened in departments across the country when complaints threatened careers and evidence threatened narratives. She typed a reply, confirming November deployment, requesting additional information about departmental structure and personnel, asking questions whose answers would shape how the assessment proceeded. The work continued, one department at a time, one assessment at a time, one pattern documented, one failure exposed, one small increment of accountability extracted from systems designed to prevent accountability's arrival. Not enough, never enough. But the alternative, accepting that patterns would persist because persistence was easier than resistance, was unacceptable to anyone who had seen what persistence of wrong patterns produced. Her father had seen it, had documented it, had died because he refused to stop seeing it, and refused to stop documenting it. His daughter would not stop either. Could not stop. The work was his legacy, and she would honor that legacy by continuing what he had started until continuing was no longer possible. She saved the email and closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring new briefings, new preparations, new steps toward an assessment that would produce its own findings, its own recommendations, its own incremental movement toward accountability that might arrive or might not, but would certainly never arrive if no one worked to produce it. The apartment settled into evening quiet as she prepared for sleep that would be interrupted by dreams of red and blue lights, of roads stretching through rural darkness, of questions that demanded answers and answers that demanded action. Progress, not victory, not completion, not the resolution that narrative demanded, but reality rarely provided. Progress would have to be enough, and tomorrow, the work would continue. The final report on the Barton County assessment was completed in December, 1 year and 2 months after the traffic stop that had initiated federal intervention. The document ran 312 pages and represented the most comprehensive external examination of a rural sheriff's department in Georgia history. Its conclusions summarized what investigation had documented: systematic failures in accountability, patterns of constitutional violations, structures designed to prevent rather than produce consequences for misconduct. Its recommendations outlined reforms that would require years to implement and decades to sustain. The executive summary contained a single paragraph that Denise had written herself, words that captured what statistics and findings and legal language could not fully convey. The patterns documented in this assessment did not emerge from individual failures by individual officers. They emerged from institutional structures that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, that promoted certain officers and marginalized others, that defined success in terms that had nothing to do with constitutional policing and everything to do with protecting the department from external accountability. Reform requires not merely discipline for individuals, but transformation of structures that produced the individuals requiring discipline. That transformation will be difficult, contested, and incomplete, but it is necessary if the promise of equal protection under law is to mean anything in jurisdictions like Barton County. The report was filed, distributed, archived in systems that would preserve its contents for researchers and reformers and anyone else who might need to understand how a department had failed and what federal intervention had attempted to accomplish. Denise received her copy in a ceremony at the Pentagon, General Morrison presenting the bound document with remarks that acknowledged what she had accomplished and what remained to be accomplished. This assessment represents extraordinary work under extraordinary circumstances. General Hartwell conducted reconnaissance that exposed her to personal risk, maintained documentation under conditions designed to prevent documentation, and survived an encounter that could have ended very differently. Her professionalism under pressure, her commitment to thoroughness despite obstacles, and her willingness to see the investigation through to conclusion regardless of personal implications. These qualities exemplify the best traditions of the Inspector General's office. The audience applauded. Colleagues whose own assessments had produced their own findings, their own recommendations, their own incremental movements toward accountability in jurisdictions across the country. None of their cases had produced indictments of county commissioners. None had reopened cases 35 years cold. None had exposed patterns extending across generations of the same families in the same department on the same roads. But each had produced something. Each had documented patterns that would otherwise remain undocumented. Each had created records that would inform future investigations, future reforms, future pressure on systems that resisted pressure until pressure became impossible to resist. The work continued because the work always continued for anyone willing to do it. That was the lesson her father had taught through his death, the legacy he had left through his documentation, the inheritance she had received through the questions he had asked and the answers he had demanded. She would honor that inheritance by asking the same questions, demanding the same answers, continuing the same work until continuing was no longer possible. And when continuing was no longer possible for her, someone else would continue. Someone she had trained, someone she had mentored, someone who understood that institutional change required institutional pressure sustained across timelines that exceeded individual careers. The ceremony concluded. The audience dispersed. The bound report took its place on Denise's shelf beside other reports, other assessments, other documents that represented careers spent asking questions that powerful people preferred unanswered. Fort Mitchell awaited. 17 complaints awaited. The same patterns, the same questions, the same work. Change was coming. Whether it would arrive before the next traffic stop, the next false arrest, the next family destroyed by encounters that could have been prevented if accountability had existed before disaster required it, that remained an open question. But the work continued. The questions continued. The pressure continued. That would have to be enough. Not because it satisfied, but because the alternative was silence. And silence had never protected anyone except those who benefited from the patterns that silence preserved.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.